First of all, as I've been doing in the class, this idea of managing ego states, which means a few things that I think are core to our growth as human beings. And that, first of all, is the importance of cultivating a contemplative practice. I say this often, but it occurs to me, I just can't say it often enough, that if you do not examine your life from some aspect of what I call the higher self, and I've broken it down into many components. If you don't examine your life from the perspective of the higher self, your life in many ways is driven by the involuntary arisings of forces in the unconscious ego self. You're not leading your life. The unconscious ego self is leading your life because forces in the unconscious ego self. So, for example, putting aside Moses and Aaron for now, if you look at the other sibling relationships, they're driven by quite dark forces. And part of the drama in the Bible is people being taken over by destructive forces of jealousy, of rage, of hurt, of revenge. Those are involuntary forces. If you go look at the story of Jacob and Esau, and when I study that, Esau becomes one of my favorite characters because he's a person who has overcome his own feelings of being wounded, his own feelings of being displaced, his own craving for revenge. And when Jacob and Esau meet up again in Genesis 32, 33, it seems very clear from my perspective that Esau has completely forgiven Jacob. Another way of saying it is he's chosen to be the person that he wants to be and not simply a person who's driven by the forces in the unconscious ego self being triggered either internally or externally, moving into the field of consciousness, taking over our consciousness, sometimes creating havoc in our lives, and then go back and recede. And here we are having to pick up the pieces. So if one does not, number one, examine the contents of consciousness, examine the forces of the unconscious ego self as they arise involuntarily, meaning from the perspective of the authentic self, they're involuntary. Of course, from the perspective of the unconscious ego self, that is their will. The will in the unconscious ego self is precisely to fill our contents of consciousness, for those forces in the unconscious ego self to have their way, for them to come into the world, recede, and then there we are having, again, to put together things that sometimes are just brought broken into pieces. So if now there are some people of good nature, and those forces don't arise very often. But one thing I've discovered, even people who don't have forces that arise and cause destruction, sometimes those very people are plagued by self-doubt, plagued by lack of courage, the need to accommodate. So a person, like, I'm not talking about anybody in this room, obviously, but there are people who appear to be very nice people, but when you look in their internal lives, there are other forces going on in them where niceness is an accommodation, not a true constant generosity of spirit, where that person can bring up courage, kind, clear, firm boundaries, living by truth and vision as the case demands. Now, how would you know? How would you know if your niceness is not just accommodating? How would you know whether you're blaming another is rooted in envy? We don't know anything until we are able to rise into what I call the aspects of the higher self, examine the contents of consciousness, look down into the unconscious ego self, make it, as it were, part of our contents of conscious. It's only unconscious until we decide to examine it. Watch the forces there, watch how they take over our contents of consciousness, and make a decision to live differently. So for me, this is the beginning of the internal work of our realization as human beings. But then we take it even a deeper level, and this is something we've been discussing on the Wednesday night class. If we think of this idea that we're all born into the world with a capacity for meaning and purpose, our own path, the disruptions that the unconscious ego self produce are distractions. They They interfere with our compass. We don't know where we're going anymore. We can't see the gifts that we have because we become so fixated on something, some force that the unconscious ego self has us to fixate on. I just want to give you a recent example. It's a recent example and also an example of, I think, my entire life as a counselor. I'll read you a little bit further back in time. I may have mentioned this before. I've asked a couple if I can use this, as long as I don't mention names, they give me permission. A man in his 40s had discovered a self-help program that he thought he was benefiting greatly from. He wanted his wife to go, thinking that she, who, however not okay he was, in his estimation, she was much more severely not okay. And since in his mind he was becoming a more okay person, wouldn't she benefit more from it? And I think secretly that she would now realize how not okay she was. He had a plan going, not just for the marriage to get better, but for his point to get across of how much work she had to do. Now, from a counselor's perspective, I privately found this man somewhat unbearably bossy, telling the other person what she had to do and having an estimation of his wife that I didn't have. I think she just was a solid person, didn't want to engage in the program. And he had a kind of the evangelical spirit about it. Says, I'm doing it and I think it's great. You have to do it. And she steadfastly refused. I'm not going to do this just to please you. You want to spend a night a week there? I don't. And it got really hot. And he said, I don't understand why she wouldn't do this for me if it's something that I really want. I've seen this so many times where somebody wants something from someone else they think is reasonable, good, or simply it would be an act of kindness to give it. And they say, I don't understand why they won't do it, which is okay. There's lots of things we don't understand. We don't even understand ourselves, much less other people, but it doesn't stop at not understanding. It goes into resentment. And resentment, of course, is the single worst force in interpersonal relationships. Whatever else goes on, resentment will kill anything good over time. So it's not just not understand, a huge reservoir of resentment got built. And from that resentment was a sense, again, all this is unconscious, that my needs are central. The way I see the world is the correct compass of the world. My standard is the gold standard, but none of that is part of awareness. The awareness is, I have something good. I don't understand why you won't take something good. Not seeing that the motivator behind it all is a kind of self-centeredness. And when a person thinks they're being good, it's very hard for them to see themselves as self-centered. So the beginning of this was my recommendation to the man to take no for an answer. And I think it was the first time that he really saw the application of this rule and how deep the rule is. Your wife is saying no. Just take no for an answer. And his resistance to taking no for an answer was classic. It just went by the script. But I don't understand. What I'm offering is something good. It wouldn't take that much out of her. It would be good for us as a relationship. We'd be doing something together. He had a whole story, which was a way of not taking no for an answer. And the more he talked, I said to him, I'm going to explain this to you in a little while. But the first thing I want you to master is taking no for an answer. And I said, because I don't think your wife is going to change her mind. There's going to be ongoing bitterness and acrimony. You're going to get resentful. She's going to become resentful. No good will come next if you just can't take a deep breath and take no for an answer. And I could see this simple rule that part of my wall of virtue practice that I teach. The deep breath, the deflation, I just don't understand. And again, my offering again, you don't need to understand, because one reason you don't understand is because you won't take no for an answer. Once you take no for an answer, then you'll start to understand. Now that led to something deep. And one thing I want to share with you, many of the rules of virtue, like mitzvahs. I mean, a mitzvah is there that imposes a duty upon us. the difference between, I'll say, a duty approach to character versus the Aristotelian approach that we've been studying in the Tuesday night class, which is reasoning toward eudaimonia, which is a profoundly important process to reason yourself toward the kind of person you want to become that will create deep inner well-being. That's profound. But on the way there are rules in place that will quicken the journey, because the duty will force you to admit things about yourself that are inhibiting you in your journey. So, for example, the duty to take no for an answer, it doesn't feel like eudaimonia. It doesn't feel like inner well-being until when you take no for an answer, you're forced to encounter your own self-centeredness. You're forced to encounter the idea that you deserve when maybe you don't. You're forced to experience the idea that you're entitled when maybe you're not entitled. You're forced to experience the idea that your will to something does not necessarily outweigh another person's will not to do something. There are so many things we have to face. We take no for an answer. On a spiritual level, we're not the center of the universe. I'm not going to say on an emotional level, empathy for the person that is not giving us what we want. No, maybe they have a hard heart. Maybe they're really not being okay, but we don't know until we go into a place of deep acceptance, of deep sadness. You're not getting your way. You think is good. One says to oneself, not fighting it anymore. I don't want to say I don't understand. I'm just sad that my needs don't align with somebody else's, what they want to do or not do. It's a very deep thing. It requires empathy, acceptance, I think maturity, seeing life as more than a given moment when you don't get your way, but the larger context of human relationships. So this one simple mitzvah, I'll call it a mitzvah, of the mitzvah to take no for an answer after a few go-arounds, for a person to really do it, you have to go deeper and deeper and deeper into yourself, and ultimately a deep sense of sadness. Yet again, something I want, I'm not getting my way. Now, once you get there, you know what I call it the holy path to sadness. It's a very deep idea in almost every spiritual tradition that I know of, that not willing to become sad is a way to avoid your work, a way to avoid growth. You can fixate on blaming, accusing, feeling depressed. There's many things we do to avoid just feeling deeply sad in an existential and in an existential way that helps us experience the depth of the human condition, and just a sense that because of the human condition, our life is not going to be based on our always getting our way. Now, when you get down to that place, and again, I want to congratulate this person. I don't think he's here tonight, but he might see this on YouTube. The amount of work that he did to see his spouse not as someone for him to work out his needs, but as an independent human being, living her life her way, ultimately, at the deepest level, having to face her death. And at some point, he had to back off and let her live her life her way and not according to his good ideas. And it brought up so much empathy for her, a deep level of acceptance. Many other problems became diminished because she was no longer simply an extension of his needs. Not only that, he began to look at his children differently, because many people look at their children as an extension of needs. My children need to behave a certain way so that I will feel better about myself as a parent. I will not feel that I've been a failure as a parent. Many parents raise their children in a way to create ego satisfaction for the parent. So many things can happen on spiritual levels, philosophical levels, psychological levels. This one little thing called taking no for an answer. So many disruptions of the unconscious ego self, anger, resentment, shame, guilt, so many things get addressed. When we move into, I think in Tibetan Buddhism is called the bittersweet heart of sadness. It's also a very clearly Jewish idea. So the cultivating of holy sadness when you're feeling those ego state disruptions is a good first idea. When you are experiencing an ego self disruption, whether it's anger, resentment, guilt, shame, fear, anxiety, whatever it is, try to imagine that you're avoiding sadness. Try to imagine you're avoiding experiencing the limitations of your own humanity, that you bumped up against either reality of the world or the reality of another person that we just don't want to accept because of the natural self-centeredness of the unconscious ego self. What many people just call the ego, I'll call it the unconscious ego self. Now, from that deep place of sadness, what my experience has been that it is the opening to the greatest degree of wisdom. I've said this many times. I'm repeating something I've said often, but I think sometimes these things are worth repeating. The one of the greatest roads to wisdom is through the bittersweet heart of sadness. Many of the poems that we study on Friday nights are poems about sadness, about people realizing a life truth that they were resisting hearing because of the sadness that it creates, the sadness that our lives aren't going to go our way, the sadness that we've lost our way, the sadness of how much work it's going to take, the sadness and the fragility of the human condition, the fragility of life in general. There are so many things that can make us sad. We avoid sadness. I think that's one reason, by the way, people avoid poetry, because so much poetry requires, appropriately so, a kind of a sadness. The wisdom that comes from sadness is not the wisdom of sagacity, meaning the person who has great knowledge and knows how to answer questions. It's an entirely different kind of wisdom. So the last thing I want to touch on tonight in my thinking about wisdom works, as I'm calling my life project. I don't change the name too quickly because I'm getting my mind around it. What makes a wise person? Knowledgeable is certainly part of it. Knowing how to answer questions is certainly part of it. Giving good guidance is certainly part of it. Um, understanding human condition is a part of it. But I think all truly wise people live with broken hearts of sadness, and they understand the deeper dimensions of every important question being answered, being asked, and how to find its way to an answer. So wisdom that is achieved through the bittersweet the bittersweet nature of the broken heart, I think, is a core element of wisdom. And one reason I'm sharing this with you is as I've been thinking about what it means to as a person who sees myself as a mentor, for me to mentor someone, I began to think, what are the qualities that I need in a student? And I realized that one of the qualities I need in a student is the broken heart of sadness. That ultimately questions come from the broken heart of sadness. With a broken heart of sadness, I think one can read poetry. I think one can understand the depths of metaphors. I think one can understand the sadness of one's own life. I might be wrong in this, but I think every person who has any kind of success accomplishment in spiritual search, one of the prerequisites is they're not avoiding the bittersweet broken heart of sadness, the terminology right. And from that place, their ability to learn, to face themselves, to see other people, to accept the human condition is greatly expanded because they're not fixated on avoiding, they're fixated on knowledge of the self, knowledge of others, and ultimately knowledge of the divine. All right, that's my talk for, thank you. That's my talk for tonight. I have a moment if anybody has a question or a comment they'd like to ask. Since I have control of the vertical and the horizontal, it makes it a little bit easier for me to take a question. Yeah, Rabbi Manning, please.
That was beautiful, Rabbi. Thank you so much. In the past, you've also talked about saying Kaddish for those disappointments that we, or dreams that we have that we now have to give up because of letting people be who they are, say what they want, and not trying to change them to fit into our idea of and our expectations. So I love the corollary of saying, getting to this place of holy sadness and then saying Kaddish for the things that you then have to leave behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, either that came to me actually, pardon me, when I was in basic training in the military. And one reason I went into the military was to get rid of a part of myself that I knew was going to drag me down for the rest of my life. And Marine Corps boot camp seemed to be a great way to do it. It worked. And then I realized I killed him off. You know, like I really did kind of kill him off. Now, of course, he got people, aspects of the self don't stay dead forever. They resurrect. But I remember waking up in the middle of the night thinking, wow, he's gone. And I never gave him a chance. And I just said Kaddish for this old part of myself. And I realized I had to give him a decent burial. And then that was one night in probably October 1973. And then as I grew, I learned how to bring him back and reintegrate him. But it's a very deep thing. When you want to transform, it almost always means you have to leave a part of yourself behind. And it's a part of self that was working on figuring out the world and adapting to the world. And something in the higher self says, if I let this aspect of myself run the world, I'm just never going to get traction. And sometimes I call it climbing out of the fires of hell, one finger grip at a time. It's just going to weigh you down. And so part of transformation means death of an aspect of the ego self, and then ultimately the resurrection and the reintegration. That's really sad work. Now, that's for me the deepest kind of holy sadness is when, in order to grow, you have to leave parts of yourself behind. I didn't know that I was only 18, that ultimately the work would be to resurrect and integrate. I didn't know that when I was 18. I'm glad I discovered it. I think what you're focusing on is the series of sadnesses that we have to go through that are perhaps not as serious as that, but at the time they feel utterly serious. And what it means to let go and just bury a need that has been weighing you down. And sometimes you just have to let go and let it fall away. And because every need that we have to let go of, there is a spark. There's a holy spark in the need. And then eventually bring it back and reintegrate it as we grow as human beings. So thank you very much for that comment. I think I only said that kind of very deep Kaddish a few times in my life when I had to say Kaddish to parts of myself that I had to let go. But I like the image that we're saying Kaddish all the time for parts of ourselves that we have to, as it were, take out of how we're living. They weigh us down too much, but always knowing that eventually we have to resurrect them and reintegrate them. Allison and Andy, yes.
Can you Oh, hi.
Hey.
Thank you. So when you were speaking, Rabbi Manning, and all the things I've learned from you, Reb Finley, when you talked a long time ago about Lev not meaning heart like we understand, but there's an aspect of it that's ego. Mm-hmm. And when Aaron was rejoicing in his heart, it's both of them had benefited almost from the emotional evolution of all the brothers that came before them. So when they came to this task, Moses was also egoless in a certain way, like me, you know, and even egoless to the point where he paused to look at the bush long enough to understand that it was miraculous. And Aaron coming out into this place that's beyond the wilderness. It was at Harad Midbar, right? It wasn't even, and how it seems like we're watching the evolution of, like you were saying, we do this with ourselves, but all the brothers in the Torah to this point have solved certain things in their evolution so that these brothers take the most holy task and they get to come to it without the burden of huge ego to the beginning. That's what it seemed like to me when I heard both of you talking tonight.
Very nicely put. Again, we have a piece of literature and we don't know the backstory, how they got there, but that's what this Torah portion seems to represent, is Moshe taking the spotlight off of himself and speaking entirely about the honor and the beautification of his brother's role. Just a quick word on the clarification of the word lev. When we think of the heart in English, we think of, as I often say, the seat of moral sentiments. In Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, it's much more neutral, with a little bit of a bias toward the negative. For example, in Genesis 6:5, Yetzer machshavot hadam rak kol hayom, the Yetzer, the shape, machshavot, the thoughts of the heart of the human being, are all bad or all day long. We think of the lev as the mind, emotion, feelings continuum. On its own, it will tend to fixate and be filled with the power of the unconscious ego self, the negative dimensions, on its own. So when you think of the lev in Hebrew, it needs guidance. It needs the guidance from the neshama, from the soul. And that's why when you see the term lev used in a positive way, it's almost always with a modifier. They'll say lev chacham, a wise heart, lev yodea, a knowing heart. So if you do a search for the word heart in the Bible, you'll see a modifier oftentimes. So when the Bible says lo tatur achrei einechem achrei levavchem, do not follow your eyes and your heart, they mean the unguided eyes and heart. Left to their own devices, they will follow the most sparkly thing, the most attractive thing. They will follow anything that the unconscious ego self pushes it toward. So the lev in Hebrew needs guidance. It needs conscience, as it were. I think many parts of our lives, we do that naturally, depend on our personality, our character. But the problem with that is there are other things that are not addressed if we don't do this in a kind of a systematic way. So who knows about Moshe and Aaron? It's a because the text is so silent, our archetypal psychological imaginations are allowed to fill in the space. That's a beautiful thing about the way we study Torah, is that we take this meager evidence and we fill it in with our own midrashic insights. So thank you for that question, and always remember, there is the unconscious ego self is always awake, always planning, always has a purpose, and oftentimes its purposes don't align with the purposes of our conscious self. And therefore, as I said at the beginning, we need constant inner work to be aware of where the metaphoric eyes and heart are going, so we can intervene, bring them back to the true path, to exert our moral compass, and then use the energy of the lev, of the mind heart continuum, to take our lives and touch the lives of others, to create I want to say osha, to create much deeper inner well-being for us all. So thank you for that.